Welcome to Reformed Thinking. Today, we're taking a deep dive into an experience that, well, I guarantee every single person listening to this is intimately familiar with.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, we are going to explore what we might call the courtroom of the ego.
Right. The endless trial.
Exactly. For our sources today, we're pulling from some really extensive exegetical studies on the biblical text of 1 Corinthians, specifically chapter 3, verse 21 through chapter 4, verse 7.
Some of the most foundational texts on this.
For sure. And we're also weaving in insights inspired by Timothy Keller's just brilliant short book, The Freedom of Self-Forgetfulness.
Such a good book.
It really is. And we'll be contrasting all of that with some fascinating psychological meta-studies on self-esteem by the psychologist Lauren Slater. So our mission for this deep dive is to uncover a radical third way to live a way that completely bypasses the modern cultural trap of endless self-inflation and the traditional trap of crushing self-loathing.
It is a totally vital mission, really, because the diagnostic landscape of the human heart is, well, it's incredibly murky.
Yeah, murky is a good word for it.
Like, if you go to a hospital with a broken arm, the diagnostic process is super clean. The doctor points to a jagged white line on an X-ray and says, there is the problem.
Right. It's objective.
Exactly. But when we try to diagnose our own psychological or spiritual ailments, the X-ray machine is just fundamentally broken. We're peering into muddy waters, trying to evaluate ourselves using instruments that are themselves compromised by our own biases.
By our own anxieties, right.
Yes.
And the symptom of that broken diagnostic machine is this relentless courtroom we all carry around in our heads. Like, if you're listening to this on your morning commute or, I don't know, while you're making breakfast, you know exactly what I mean.
Oh, they definitely know.
You wake up, and almost instantly the trial begins. You step into the docket, the questions just start firing. Am I successful enough for my age?
Am I a good enough parent?
Yeah. Or, what did my boss actually mean by that slightly passive-aggressive email yesterday?
Right, the endless over-analysis.
Totally. Am I respected? We just live in a society that is fundamentally obsessed with self-evaluation. Every single moment of our day is subjected to an internal performance review.
It's exhausting. And what makes this so challenging is how our modern culture has diagnosed the root cause of all this anxiety and, well, human misbehavior.
The self-esteem movement.
Precisely. For the better part of the last 4 or 5 decades, educational institutions, psychological frameworks, and just the broader media have operated under the unquestioned dogma of the modern self-esteem movement.
Yeah, I remember this growing up. The message was just ubiquitous.
The prevailing narrative has been that the primary driver of relational breakdown, crime, lack of productivity, and general societal pathology is low self-esteem.
Right.
The diagnosis was that people do bad things because they just don't value themselves enough.
It was built into all the school curriculums. Like, if we could just get everyone to love themselves more, to affirm themselves more, to look in the mirror and declare their inherent greatness, then all of society's ills would just, evaporate.
But the data tells a completely different story.
Yeah, the data from Lauren Slater's research.
Right. Her review of the meta-studies shows that the cultural narrative is actually dangerously wrong. It is empirically incorrect.
Which is wild to think about, given how entrenched it is.
It is. And psychological research has finally been catching up to what biblical wisdom has declared for millennia. Slater's review, The Trouble with Self-Esteem, highlighted empirical meta-studies demonstrating that artificially inflated self-esteem does not lead to virtuous, peaceful citizens.
What does it lead to?
Well, it strongly correlates with narcissism, a deep sense of entitlement, and heightened aggression.
Wait, really? That correlation with aggression is what actually really caught my attention in the source material. Why does feeling good about yourself make you more likely to lash out?
Because artificially high self-esteem is inherently fragile.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, I mean, when you construct a massive inflated ego based entirely on self-affirmation, you become hypersensitive to anything that might puncture it.
Like a balloon.
It's exactly like a balloon. If an individual with this artificially constructed high view of themselves encounters someone who threatens that self-image through criticism, outperforming them, or just failing to show the expected deference, the reaction is not peaceful confidence.
Right, because true confidence wouldn't care.
Exactly. The reaction is aggressive retaliation. They lash out to protect the fragile construct of their own supremacy.
So relying on, just feeling good about yourself is a completely inadequate foundation for any kind of moral virtue or societal peace.
Completely
It's
inadequate.
like building a skyscraper on a foundation of styrofoam. The moment the wind blows, the whole thing just collapses into defensive anger.
That is a perfect analogy. And traditional cultures, prior to the modern psychological era, actually grasped this dynamic much better than we do today.
Oh, for sure.
Ancient societies, whether we look at classical Greek literature or ancient Near Eastern wisdom, recognized that the root of human evil wasn't low self-esteem. It was hubris, pride. It was an excessively high, self-centered view of oneself that manifested in overreaching ambition and, a refusal to submit to any higher authority.
But, I mean, we can't just romanticize the traditional approach either, right? Because their solution to the problem of hubris was incredibly destructive in its own right.
Oh, totally destructive.
If the modern trap is self-inflation, the traditional trap was trying to crush individual pride through intense societal shame, rigid legalism, or a kind of fatalistic self-loathing. You would literally beat yourself up, sometimes physically, often psychologically, just to keep yourself humble.
And that leaves humanity perpetually trapped in a pendulum swing between two catastrophic errors. On one side, you have the traditional trap of self-mortification. On the other side, the modern trap of narcissistic ego building. But here is the profound insight that Keller draws out in the source material. Both of these extremes suffer from the exact same underlying disease.
Which is that they both keep the self at the absolute center of the universe. Like, if I am staring in the mirror telling myself how amazing I am obsessed with myself. But if I am curled up in a ball beating myself up over all my failures and inadequacies, I am still entirely obsessed with myself.
Right.
The ego is still the subject, the verb, and the object of my entire internal life.
It is a suffocating way to live. The ego is acting like a black hole, drawing all light and attention inward. This is why the biblical concept of gospel humility is so revolutionary.
Let's define that.
Yeah, we need to define this carefully because it flies in the face of all our cultural assumptions. Gospel humility is not thinking less of yourself.
Okay.
It's not an exercise in false modesty where you pretend you don't possess certain talents or intellect. And it is certainly not obsessively dwelling on your own worthlessness.
So what is it?
Gospel humility is the glorious supernatural state of self-forgetfulness. It is, simply put, thinking of yourself less.
Thinking of yourself less. Wow, that sounds like taking off a 100-pound backpack after a 10-mile hike.
Doesn't
It implies that a heart radically renewed by the gospel is freed from that endless, torturous courtroom of self-evaluation we were just talking about. The ego just stops being so intensely fascinating to us.
It loses its magnetic pull.
Right. But to really understand how the Apostle Paul dismantles this courtroom and offers us this freedom, we have to look at the people he was actually writing to. We need to travel back to the first century and immerse ourselves in the historical atmosphere of a city called Corinth.
Yes, the context is everything here.
Because the believers Paul is addressing were swimming in a culture that makes our modern, clout-chasing social media landscape look tame.
The socio-historical environment of first-century Corinth is absolutely essential for understanding Paul's argument. Corinth was not just another city on the map. It had a really unique and aggressive personality.
How so?
Well, the original Greek city was completely destroyed by the Romans in 146 BC. For 100 years, it just lay in ruins. Then, in 44 BC, Julius Caesar reestablished it as a Roman colony. Because of its brilliant strategic location on the Isthmus of Greece, connecting the Peloponnese to the mainland, it quickly exploded into a bustling, highly prosperous, cosmopolitan metropolis. It was the major hub of maritime trade between the eastern and western halves of the Roman Empire.
It's really important to contrast this with a city like ancient Athens, right?
Absolutely.
Athens was the old money. It was characterized by landed aristocracy, ancient philosophical lineages, and deep-rooted traditions. But Corinth was the exact opposite.
Corinth was new money.
New money. It was defined by rapid social mobility, fierce commercial competition, and this intense cultural obsession with acquiring personal status. I think a fair modern equivalent would be to imagine a hybrid of Wall Street, Las Vegas, and Silicon Valley all mashed together on an ancient trade route.
That is a very accurate sociological picture. Classical scholars like Bruce Winter have extensively documented this dynamic, identifying it as the Greco-Roman obsession with philotimia.
Philotimia.
Yeah, that word literally translates to the love of honor. In a city like Corinth, where status was highly fluid because of the new wealth flowing through the ports, that status was fiercely contested. Citizens, freedmen, and wealthy merchants were all aggressively competing for public prestige, political influence, and dominance in the public square.
And the engine that drove this massive status competition was the Roman patronage system. This wasn't just a cultural quirk, this was the foundational economic and social structure of the entire city.
It was the bedrock of Roman society. In the patronage system, wealthy and influential individuals, the patrons, would use their resources to finance public works, sponsor artists, and provide legal or financial protection to lower-class individuals.
And those were the clients.
Right, known as their clients.
Yeah.
Now, to modern ears, that might sound like philanthropy,
Yeah, it sounds nice.
but it was absolutely not charity.
It is a transaction.
A highly calculated transaction. In exchange for this financial or legal backing, the clients owed the patron intense public loyalty, political support, and most importantly, public praise.
So they basically bought fans.
Essentially, yes. There was a daily ritual known as the salutatio. Every morning, patrons' clients were expected to gather at his house, wait in line, greet him with elaborate titles of respect, and then physically escort him down to the public forum.
So your actual worth and influence in Corinthian society was visibly measured by the size, the wealth, and the eloquence of the entourage walking behind you.
Visibly measured every single day.
If you were a public orator or a philosopher, you were constantly trying to attract wealthier patrons and a larger crowd of clients. You were essentially building a personal brand.
Building a brand is a perfect modern analogy. The culture explicitly trained its citizens to constantly compare themselves with others. You formed partisan factions around prominent public figures, and you derived your own personal honor from your association with a superior leader.
While simultaneously looking down on anyone attached to a rival faction, I assume.
Of course, that was part of the game.
Which brings us to the explosive collision at the heart of this deep dive. If Corinth is this intense pressure cooker of philotemia, of status competition and clout chasing, what happens when Paul arrives and drops the message of a crucified Jewish Messiah right into the middle of the forum?
It was a profound cultural shock. I mean, we know from the historical record in the book of Acts that Paul planted the church in Corinth during his second missionary journey, working alongside a couple named Aquila and Priscilla, making tents to support himself.
A blue-collar worker.
Yeah. And Paul's message was the unvarnished gospel of Jesus Christ crucified. In the context of Roman Corinth, proclaiming a crucified God was not just strange, it was socially repulsive.
Because to the Greeks, honor was everything, and crucifixion was the ultimate public shaming.
The ultimate.
It was a punishment reserved for the lowest slaves and insurrectionists. It was designed to completely strip a person of any honor or dignity.
Precisely. Paul himself acknowledges this in the first chapter of his letter, calling the cross a stumbling block to Jews and absolute foolishness to the Greeks. Yet, despite this cultural repulsion, the Holy Spirit moved powerfully. People believed.
A church was born.
A church was formed. And it wasn't just a small, struggling gathering. It experienced remarkable growth and was richly endowed with spiritual gifts. But here's the tragedy that prompts Paul's letter. These new believers did not leave their cultural baggage at the door.
They imported the patronage system straight into the church.
They brought the worldly dynamics of Roman patronage, rhetorical competition, and status-seeking right to the communion table. Rather than having their minds and social interactions radically renewed by the humility of the gospel, they organized themselves into competing religious factions.
Paul calls them out explicitly. He says they are divided, declaring, I follow Paul, or I follow Apollos, or I follow Cephas, meaning Peter, or the ultimate trump card of spiritual pride, I follow Christ.
Right, the super spiritual faction.
Yeah. They took these humble men who had risked their lives to preach the gospel, and they turned them into status symbols. They turned them into party labels.
This represents a catastrophic theological misunderstanding of their new identity in the new covenant. Let's look at Apollos, for example. We know he was an incredibly eloquent, highly educated Jewish teacher from Alexandria, which was a center of ancient learning.
So he was a fantastic speaker.
Oh, incredibly gifted. You can easily imagine the culturally elite, status-conscious Corinthians gravitating toward him. They would claim that his rhetorical brilliance and allegorical sophistication made their specific faction superior to the others.
They were treating the glorious, paradigm-shattering gospel of sovereign grace as if it were just another brand of Hellenistic philosophy.
That's exactly what they were doing.
And they were treating the apostles like competing street corner philosophers, trying to decide whose entourage gave them the most social capital. But this completely contradicts the entire logic of the cross.
Okay.
The cross is about the ultimate lowering of status to save the unworthy. The cross destroys human pride, yet the Corinthians are using the very messengers of the cross to build their own egos. It's like it's like finding a lifeboat on a sinking ship, and instead of using it to save people, you turn it upside down, paint it gold, and use it as a throne to show everyone how important you are.
That analogy captures the absurdity perfectly. Using a lifeboat as a throne.
Yeah.
In the opening chapters, Paul reminds them that God intentionally chooses the foolish, weak, low, and despised things of the world to shame the wise, specifically so that no human being might boast in the presence of God.
Yeah.
The factionalism in Corinth wasn't just a sign of sociological immaturity. It was a theological disaster that threatened to hollow out the gospel entirely.
So to fix this disaster, Paul knows he can't just tell them to play nice and get along. He has to completely shatter their entire conceptual framework of what it means to boast.
Right, he has to go to the root.
No. He has to take a sledgehammer to the foundation of their pride. Which brings us to the first major text in our deep dive. 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 21 through 23, and the absolute absurdity of boasting. Paul issues a sweeping absolute prohibition. He writes, "So then, let no one boast in men."
We need to pause on that word boast. The Greek verb Paul uses here is kaukomai.
Kokomai.
Yes, this is a foundational loaded term in Pauline theology. When we use the word boast in modern English, we usually mean bragging about getting a promotion at work or, telling a slightly exaggerated story about our accomplishment.
Hi, just talking yourself up.
But kaukomai goes much deeper. It signifies the act of exulting, glorying, or grounding your ultimate confidence and security in a specific object.
So it's about where you derive your core identity.
Yes. So when Paul commands, let no one boast in men, he isn't just saying, stop bragging about your favorite pastor. He is forbidding them from placing their ultimate value, their security, or their sense of worth in any human agent, including themselves.
He could have used milder words if he just wanted them to tone down their praise, right?
You could have used megaliner, which means to magnify, or ane, which means to praise. But he specifically chooses kauchomai because he is targeting the idolatrous ground of human self-trust.
Wow.
He is pointing back to the Old Testament prophet Jeremiah, who said, let not the wise man boast in his wisdom. Let not the mighty man boast in his might. Let not the rich man boast in his riches. But let him who boasts boast in this, that he understands and knows me, that I am the Lord.
So Paul is saying, do not derive your identity from your leaders. Do not use them to inflate your ego.
Exactly. And the rationale he provides for this prohibition is absolutely staggering.
This is where the text just blows the doors off our normal way of thinking. He says, let no one boast in men, for all things are yours. He doesn't say stop boasting because boasting is obnoxious and it's hurting people's feelings. He says stop boasting because it is fundamentally irrational. You are fighting over scraps when you already own the universe.
He provides a breathtaking cosmic inventory to prove his point. Listen to the scope of this inheritance, he writes. Whether Paul or Apollos or Cephas or the world or life or death or the present or the future, all are yours.
Yes, massive.
The Corinthians are bickering in the gutters over whether they belong to the party of Paul or the party of Apollos. Paul completely reverses their paradigm. He says, you don't belong to Paul. Paul belongs to you. God gave Paul, Apollos, and Peter as gifts to serve your spiritual growth.
I want to break down that inventory because it's so vast, it almost sounds like hyperbole. Like, I understand how pastors are given to the church. I can even abstractly understand how the world or life belongs to the believer in the sense that we are meant to reign with Christ in the new creation. But Paul explicitly includes death on the list of things that belong to the Christian.
Right.
How does a Christian own death? That sounds completely insane to the modern ear. Death is the thing that owns us. Death is the ultimate conqueror that wipes out every human ambition.
It does sound insane until you view it through the lens of Christ's resurrection.
Okay.
To the natural man, death is indeed the ultimate tyrant, the master that enslaves us through fear our entire lives. But for the believer who is united to Christ, death has been utterly defeated and transformed. It has been demoted from a tyrant to a servant.
A servant.
Death is now merely the vehicle, the dark doorway that God uses to usher the believer into eternal glory and the direct presence of Christ. It cannot harm you. It can only serve God's ultimate purpose for your glorification. Therefore, It is on the inventory of things that belong to you. It works for you.
That reframes reality entirely, and he says the present or the future are yours. The present, with all its suffering and confusion, belongs to the believer because God is actively working all things together for their good.
Exactly.
And the future is guaranteed because our inheritance is kept in heaven, imperishable and undefiled. We don't have to scramble and claw for a legacy in the future. It is already ours.
But Paul ensures this doesn't become a new source of arrogant human pride. He grounds this massive inheritance with a vital, closing theological clause. In verse 23, he writes, "And you are Christ's, and Christ is God's."
The ultimate anchor.
Yes. This establishes a redemptive hierarchy. Possession is strictly subordinated to belonging. You only possess all things because you belong exclusively to Jesus Christ.
You're not the master of the universe on your own.
Exactly. You are his purchased possession, bought with the price of his blood. The self is not self-owned, it is not self-created, and it is not self-justifying. The believer's identity is infinitely secure, precisely because they are united to the sovereign heir of all things.
So, to summarize the logic here, if we own the universe in Christ, and if we belong entirely to Christ, it makes zero sense to idolize human leaders or use them to pump up our own egos. It is an irrational denial of our actual wealth.
Exactly right.
But that raises a very practical dilemma. If we aren't supposed to put human leaders on a pedestal, how are we supposed to view them? How should we view the people standing behind the pulpit, writing the theology books, or leading the ministries?
Paul addresses this directly as he moves into chapter 4, verses 1 and 2, where he radically redefines ministry.
Yeah, in 1 Corinthians 4.1, Paul instructs the church on how to adopt an accurate, sober mental assessment of their leaders. And to do this, he uses two very specific, distinctly unglamorous Greek words to describe himself, Apollos and Peter. He commands the church to regard them as hyperetos and oikonomos.
Let's unpack the imagery behind those words, starting with hyperetos.
What exactly is an under-rower?
The word hyperetos originally denoted a subordinate laborer, specifically an under-rower, situated in the lower decks of a large ancient warship, like a trireme.
A trireme.
Yeah. Now picture the environment of a trireme. There are multiple tiers of rowers. If you are a hyperetos, you are down in the belly of the ship. It is dark, it is sweltering, and it smells of sweat and seawater.
Sounds miserable.
It was. But most importantly, you have absolutely no view of the horizon. You cannot see where the ship is going. Your only job is to listen to the rhythmic pounding of the captain's mallet and pull your oar in strict obedience to his beat.
That is a staggering metaphor for Christian ministry. Paul deliberately avoids any titles that carry social prestige in the Greco-Roman world. He doesn't use the word desatos, which means master, or archon, which means ruler, or even kyrios, Lord.
Right.
He chooses a word that highlights humble, sweaty, blind obedience under the absolute authority of the ship's captain, who is Christ.
He is completely stripping the ministry of its perceived glamour. The minister is not the visionary captain standing on the deck with the wind blowing through his hair, charting the course. He is a subordinate laborer.
And what about the second word, oikonomos?
An oikonomos in the ancient world was a household steward. This was typically a trusted servant or slave who was put in charge of managing the master's estate.
Okay.
Their duties included balancing the accounts and distributing resources, like daily food rations, to the rest of the household. The crucial conceptual element of a steward is that he owns absolutely nothing.
Nothing is his.
Right. The estate is not his. The resources are not his. The authority is entirely derived. Paul says ministers are simply stewards tasked with dispensing the mysteries of God, which refers to the revealed truth of the gospel of Jesus Christ.
I look at these two words, the blind, sweating under-rower, and the steward who owns nothing, and I cannot help but see a glaring, almost painful contrast with how we operate in modern evangelicalism.
It is quite jarring.
If we extrapolate Paul's definition and apply it to our current church culture, it is a devastating critique.
It is a profound indictment of the pragmatism and celebrity culture that infects so much of the modern church. We routinely build massive ecclesiastical structures around a charismatic, CEO-style leader.
All the time.
We assess pastoral candidates based on their entrepreneurial vision, their personal magnetism, their marketability, and their ability to draw a crowd. But when a church builds its identity and its operational model around a human personality, it is committing the exact same carnal sin of Corinthian factionalism.
We take the guy sweating in the bottom of the boat and we demand that he put on a captain's hat and tell us his 10-year vision for the ocean. We
Yes.
take the steward, who is supposed to be handing out the master's bread, and we treat him like he owns the estate. We completely distort the roles.
We do. And in verse 2, Paul strips away all of our modern corporate metrics for evaluating these ministers.
Yeah.
He writes, "Moreover, it is required in stewards that one be found faithful."
Faithful.
The Greek word is pistos. That is the single, exclusive requirement. Paul does not say it is required that a steward be original. He doesn't say a steward must be entertaining or culturally relevant or universally approved by the surrounding society. The only metric is whether he is faithfully executing the orders of the master and accurately distributing the master's goods.
This idea of faithfulness being the sole metric is incredibly disruptive because we are wired to evaluate. We love to judge things. We are conditioned to give Uber drivers 5 stars. We leave Yelp reviews for restaurants. We critique the pastor's sermon on the car ride home, analyzing his delivery and his illustrations.
It's second nature.
Right. So how does Paul's focus on the master's evaluation short-circuit our human obsession with constantly rating other people's performance?
It short-circuits it by completely removing our jurisdiction.
What do you mean?
Think about the household steward. If the steward is distributing food according to the master's exact instructions, it does not matter if the other servants in the house think the portions are too small or if they don't like the way the steward speaks. The other servants don't have the authority to fire him.
Oh, that makes sense.
The minister is accountable upward to the master long before he is accountable outwardly to the audience. Because the steward is handling property that belongs exclusively to God, only God has the right, the authority, and the perfect knowledge required to issue the final evaluation on that stewardship.
And this singular focus on the ultimate evaluation of the master leads us directly into what I consider the most psychologically profound part of this entire deep dive.
It really is.
Paul recognizes this human addiction to judgment. So in 1 Corinthians 4:3-5, he begins a radical dismantling of the very courtrooms where we try to find our verdicts.
Yes, Paul maps out the exact landscape of human anxiety here. He addresses 3 distinct tribunals where humans desperately seek validation. We can call them the court of human opinion, the court of self-evaluation, and finally, the ultimate eschatological court of the Lord.
Let's walk through these because this is where the theology hits our daily anxiety head on. Let's start with the court of human opinion. Paul is writing to a church that has literally been evaluating his rhetorical skills, comparing him to Apollos, and finding him lacking. How does he respond to their judgment?
He responds with a statement of profound, almost shocking detachment. He says, "But to me it is a very small thing that I should be examined by you or by any human court."
A very small thing.
Yes. The literal Greek phrase he uses for human court is anthropinas homeros, which translates to human day. It was an idiom referring to a secular human tribunal, contrasting it with the day of the Lord. He is entirely dismissing both the judgment of the Corinthian congregation and the standards of the broader secular culture.
Imagine the psychological freedom of that statement. To be able to look at public opinion, to look at your harshest critics, the social media comments, or the cultural elite who think your beliefs are foolish and say, your judgment of me is a very small thing.
It's incredibly freeing.
And it's crucial to note, he isn't saying this out of arrogance. He isn't saying, I'm so much smarter than you. He is simply stating a jurisdictional fact. They do not sit on the judge's bench. They don't have the authority to render a verdict on his soul.
Exactly.
But then Paul goes a step further, and this is the part that completely shatters the modern therapeutic paradigm. He addresses the court of the self.
This is the absolute crux of the passage regarding the ego. After dismissing human opinion, Paul writes, "Indeed, I do not even examine myself."
Okay, I have to stop you there. Because everything we are taught, from kindergarten all the way through corporate leadership seminars, is about the supreme importance of self-awareness and self-evaluation.
Oh, absolutely. It's the modern gospel.
We are told that as long as we are at peace with ourselves, as long as we are living our truth and our conscience is clear, then we are completely justified. Are you saying Paul is throwing out the concept of a clear conscience?
He is not throwing out the value of a clear conscience, but he is entirely rejecting the self as the final tribunal of truth.
Okay, unpack that.
He goes on to say, "For I am conscious of nothing against myself, yet I am not justified by this." He uses the Greek word synodesis for conscience. He is saying, as I look at my ministry, my conscience is clear. I don't know of any unconfessed sin or rebellion right now. but he explicitly, emphatically states that a clear conscience does not justify him.
Let's put an analogy on this to make it crystal clear. Trusting your own self-evaluation to declare yourself righteous is like holding a trial where you are the defendant, you are the defense attorney, you are the prosecuting attorney, and you are the judge.
It's a kangaroo court.
It is a rigged jury from the start. Our internal courtroom is hopelessly corrupted by our own self-deception, our inherent biases, our blind spots, and the remaining corruption of our nature. Even if I declare myself innocent, my verdict cannot be trusted because my vision is blurred. I simply do not have access to all the facts about my own hidden motives.
That is a profound and accurate way to understand it. A clear conscience is not an infallible conscience. Human introspection is deeply polluted. Jeremiah 17 tells us the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. Who can understand it?
Right.
This is why self-acquittal is absolutely not the same thing as divine justification.
Yeah.
And this points us directly to the bedrock of Reformed theology and the biblical gospel, the doctrine of justification by faith alone.
We need to go deep into this because Paul uses a very specific, loaded legal word when he says, I am not justified by this.
Yes, the Greek word he uses is dedikaishmai. It is a forensic legal term used in the courtroom, meaning to be officially declared righteous, to be acquitted, or to be vindicated by the judge.
A legal declaration.
Precisely. Paul is grounding his psychological freedom in the reality of the divine courtroom. He is declaring that the final verdict of our worth, our innocence, and our standing before God cannot be manufactured internally. You cannot generate your own justification by having high self-esteem, by doing good works, or by concluding that you are a generally good person.
The verdict has to come from outside of us.
Yes, it must be an alien righteousness. We are justified entirely outside of ourselves through the objective forensic verdict of God. And that verdict is not based on our intrinsic goodness. It is based solely on the historical, completed work of Jesus Christ as our substitute. Theologians often speak of this in two parts: Christ's active obedience and his passive obedience.
For the listener who might not be familiar with those terms, let's bring that down to ground level. What is the difference between active and passive obedience, and how do they secure this not guilty verdict?
Passive obedience refers to Christ's suffering and death on the cross. He passively endured the wrath of God, absorbing the penalty that our sins deserved. If we think of our sin as an infinite moral debt, his passive obedience pays the debt down to zero.
We're no longer in the red.
We are no longer condemned. But a zero balance isn't enough to enter heaven. We need perfect righteousness. That is where his active obedience comes in. Throughout his earthly life, Jesus actively and perfectly obeyed every demand of God's moral law. He lived the life we fail to live.
So he pays off the negative debt, and then he deposits an infinite amount of positive funds, his perfect righteousness, into our account.
Exactly. And in justification, that perfect record is imputed or credited to us by faith alone. When God the judge looks at the believer, he does not see our flawed self-evaluations or our polluted good works. He sees the perfect righteousness of Christ.
And the practical, psychological impact of this doctrine is staggering. If the believer's final verdict of not guilty and perfectly righteous is already secured by Christ and already declared by God, it means we don't have to constantly scramble to justify ourselves.
The trial is over.
The verdict is already in. We don't have to wake up every morning and put ourselves on trial. The courtroom of the ego is permanently closed.
That is the essence of gospel freedom. That is the true freedom of self-forgetfulness. Paul concludes this section by establishing the supreme judge. He says, "But the one who examines me is the Lord. Therefore, do not judge anything before the appointed time until the Lord comes."
He is enforcing what theologians call an eschatological reserve. He is telling the Corinthians, wait for the last day. Stop trying to preempt the final judgment.
Yes. When Christ returns, the eschaton, the end of history, arrives. And Paul says Christ will do two things. First, he will bring to light the things hidden in darkness, exposing the inner motives of the heart.
Which is terrifying on one hand.
It profoundly humbles us because we realize that only God truly knows the depth and complexity of our hearts. It shatters any illusion that we can accurately judge ourselves or others. Second, Paul says, then each one will receive his praise from God. And that truth is what liberates us. The only praise that ultimately matters, the only verdict that has eternal weight and permanence, will come from the lips of God himself.
Which means every good thing we have, every success in our careers, every spiritual gift, every moment of eloquence is not a trophy of our inherent greatness that we earn to present at the trial. It is entirely a gift.
The pure gift.
And this leads directly into the inescapable logic of sovereign grace that Paul lays out in chapter 4, verses 6 and 7. Paul takes all of this soaring theology regarding the courtrooms and justification, and he corners the Corinthians with it.
He brilliantly uses himself and Apollos as object lessons. He says he has applied these principles to himself and Apollos so that the church may learn a crucial canonical boundary. He writes that you may learn by us not to go beyond what is written.
What is written? He's referring to the Old Testament scriptures there, right?
He is. The phrase what is written is a standard formula for referencing the authority of Scripture. Throughout the Old Testament, the Scriptures consistently and relentlessly exalt divine sovereignty and intentionally crush human pride. We already mentioned Jeremiah 9. You can look at Deuteronomy 8, where God warns Israel not to say, "My power and the might of my hand have gotten me this wealth."
Right, God gave them the power.
When we violate Scripture's consistent teaching on grace, we end up doing exactly what the Corinthians did. Paul uses a highly descriptive Greek verb to diagnose their condition: physio.
Puffed up.
Puffed up. It literally means to be inflated, like a bellows being filled with hot air. The Corinthian ego was unnaturally expanded, bloated with arrogance, favoring one human leader over another. To puncture this bloated, delicate ego, Paul unleashes a rapid-fire sequence of 3 devastating rhetorical questions.
Let's look closely at these 3 questions because they are meticulously designed to leave the proud human heart utterly speechless. Question number 1. Who makes you to differ?
The verb there is diakrino, which means to distinguish, to evaluate, or to declare superior. Paul is essentially asking, who made you better than anyone else? Who separated you from the mass of humanity and gave you these gifts?
And the answer is obvious.
The implied, undeniable answer is God. There is no innate, biological, intellectual, or spiritual superiority residing within any believer. Any difference in gifting, any difference in grace, any difference in opportunity is sovereignly ordained and distributed by God, not generated by your own exceptionalism.
Which leads right into question number 2, and this is the one that really acts as a theological wrecking ball. What do you have that you did not receive?
This is the hammer of sovereign grace. The verb emphasizes a passive historical reception. I want you to really think about the comprehensive nature of this question. Your intellect? Received.
Yeah.
Your physical health and the beating of your heart?
Yeah.
Received.
Your spiritual gifts?
Received. The socioeconomic realities of where you were born? Received. And most importantly, your faith in your salvation itself. Every single bit of it is received as an unmerited gift.
We need to pause here and extrapolate the theology because this question utterly demolishes any system of works righteousness. It demolishes any theological framework that suggests human beings contribute to their own salvation autonomously.
It absolutely does. Throughout church history, there have been theological systems that attempt to elevate human free will to the point of being the decisive, ultimate factor in salvation.
Right, like Pelagianism.
Exactly. You see this in historical controversies with Pelagianism, which taught that man is basically good and can choose God on his own. You see variations of it in systems that suggest God provides the grace, but man must provide the decisive spark of faith from his own unfallen ability.
Right.
But if you look at verse 7, it creates an insurmountable problem for those views. If faith itself were an uncaused contribution generated from within man, rather than a sovereign gift of grace granted by God, then man would have a legitimate legal reason to boast.
Right. If salvation requires 99% of God's grace, but I provide the final 1% of effort, my own autonomous decision, my own superior spiritual sensitivity, then I can brag about that 1%. I could look at my neighbor who rejected the gospel and say, well, God offered us both the same grace, but I was just a little bit smarter or a little bit more humble or a little bit wiser to choose it.
Which is the definition of boasting.
But Paul's question completely destroys that 1%. What do you have that you did not receive? Even the faith to believe the gospel is a gift. Grace alone silences all boasting. Which leads to the third and final question. If you received it, why do you boast as if you had not?
That question exposes the ultimate staggering irrationality of human pride. To boast about a gift as if it were a personal achievement is a brazen denial of reality. It is a form of spiritual delusion.
It makes no sense.
If someone hands you a winning lottery ticket worth $1 billion, you don't call a press conference to brag about your incredible financial acumen and investment strategy. You praise the sheer generosity of the giver. To do otherwise is absurd.
As we unpack this, observing the inescapable logic of grace, there is such a profound sense of relief. If absolutely everything is grace, it means I don't have to be the self-made architect of my own salvation. And taking it further, I don't have to be the self-made architect of my own worth or identity in this world.
Yes, the burden is lifted.
The burden of self-creation in the modern era is crushing people. We are constantly told to build our brand, curate our identity online, make a name for ourselves, hustle and grind until we are undeniable. Sovereign grace removes that exhausting burden entirely.
It does. It shifts the entire weight of existence and justification off of our fragile shoulders and places it eternally on the unbreakable shoulders of Christ. And if we truly deeply believe this theology of sovereign grace, it cannot remain abstract. It must radically alter how we live our daily lives.
Let's move into that daily application. How do we translate this high, soaring theology of justification and sovereign grace into practical execution on, say, a Tuesday afternoon? Let's start with how we handle the opinions of others, specifically the two extremes, criticism and praise.
The two great tests of the ego.
Because those are the two primary things that send the human ego spinning out of control. Let's start with criticism.
In the normal, unredeemed courtroom of the ego, criticism is a devastating event. Because your ego is the center of your universe, an attack on your performance is an attack on your core identity.
Right, it feels like an existential threat.
So if your boss criticizes your project, or someone criticizes your parenting style or your ministry, your ego typically reacts in one of two ways. It either collapses into deep despair, believing the absolute worst about yourself and agreeing with the condemnation, or it flies into a rage of defensive, aggressive self-justification, trying to tear down the critic.
Right, the flight or fight of the ego. You either want to hide under the bed and quit, or you want to draft a 5-page email explaining why they are completely wrong and structurally incompetent.
Exactly. The gospel self-forgetfulness, anchored in the fact that your final verdict is already secured in Christ, allows you to receive criticism without either of those destructive reactions. Because you inherently know that human opinion, the human day Paul talked about, is not the final verdict on your soul. You don't have to panic. Your identity is not at stake. Therefore, you can look at the criticism calmly and objectively. You can ask yourself, is there truth in this? Did I actually drop the ball? Is there a sin of pride or laziness here that I need to confess?
And if there is,
you simply agree with it, confess it, and rest in Christ's imputed righteousness. You don't have to defend the error. And if, after prayerful consideration, you realize the criticism is unjust or based on a misunderstanding, you can simply discard it without harboring bitter resentment. You're completely free to listen, to learn, and to be corrected without being destroyed.
that is a legitimate superpower in the modern workplace. To be undestroyable by critique because your foundation is elsewhere. But what about the other side of the coin? What about praise? Because honestly, while criticism hurts, praise can be just as dangerous, if not more so. It intoxicates the ego.
It is deeply intoxicating. When the ego is at the center of the stage, praise inflates you. It triggers that physio, that puffing up. It makes you feel superior to those around you, leading you right back into the Corinthian trap.
So how do we handle it?
But again, the freedom of self-forgetfulness provides a profoundly different way to process success. When someone praises you, you do not have to exercise the awkward routine of false modesty. You don't have to hang your head, shuffle your feet, and say, oh no, I'm terrible, it was nothing, my work is garbage.
Which is really just another form of pride, because it forces the person to compliment you a second time to reassure you. It still draws all the attention back to yourself.
Exactly. It's a black hole for attention. Instead, the self-forgetful person can simply acknowledge the gift. You can look the person in the eye, say a genuine, joyful thank you for the encouragement, and then internally, in the quietness of your own heart, you immediately pass the glory right up to God.
You recognize it as a gift you received, not a status you generated.
Yes, you can honestly, deeply enjoy the fact that God used you to accomplish something good without for a second worshiping the instrument he used. You remain the under-rower, grateful that the captain allowed you to pull the oar.
So, practically speaking, how do we build this mindset? We have decades of muscle memory telling us to obsess over ourselves. How do we actually stop?
By actively cultivating deep, habitual gratitude through what we might call the sovereign grace principle. It needs to move from a theological concept to a daily mental reflex.
What does that look like?
Whenever you are tempted to feel superior to someone else, Maybe you find yourself looking down on a coworker who doesn't grasp concepts as quickly as you do, or you want to boast about your clean moral living compared to a neighbor, or you feel proud of your theological knowledge. You must aggressively stop and ask yourself Paul's devastating question. What do I have that I did not receive?
It functions like a circuit breaker for human pride.
It does. It interrupts the flow of arrogance. When you truly recognize that every breath in your lungs, every functioning synapse in your brain, every open door of opportunity, and every spiritual blessing you possess is an entirely unmerited bestowal from a gracious God, pride is rendered logically impossible. Deep gratitude replaces arrogance. You cannot look down on another human being when you realize that you are both simply beggars who have been recipients of divine charity.
I want to pause here and address you, the listener, directly for a moment.
Right.
Think about the specific sphere in your life right now where you feel the absolute most anxiety. Maybe it's your career and the constant pressure to hit your numbers or secure that promotion. Maybe it's your parenting and you lay awake at night wondering if your mistakes are ruining your kids.
We all have that sphere.
Right. Maybe it's your standing in a particular friend group or even your reputation within your local church. I want you to ask yourself, how much of that anxiety, that tight knot in your stomach, comes directly from you trying to act as the prosecuting attorney, the defense attorney, and the ultimate judge in your own internal courtroom?
That's the real issue.
How much mental and emotional energy are you wasting every single day trying to construct a final verdict about your own worth? A verdict that you do not even possess the jurisdictional authority to pronounce.
That is the pivotal diagnostic cushion for the human heart. As long as you are frantically trying to write the final verdict on your own life, you will never, ever experience peace. You will constantly oscillate. You will either be paralyzed by the crushing fear of failure and exposure, or you will be driven by the exhausting, endless need to prove your superiority over everyone else.
We have to close the courtroom. We have to shut the doors, turn off the lights, and walk away because the final verdict has already been read.
It has been read, it has been recorded in the blood of Christ, and the verdict is justified. And that objective reality changes absolutely everything about how we interact with the world.
Which brings us full circle to summarize our journey today. We started by looking at the universal trap. We are all naturally trapped by the relentless, insatiable demands of the human ego. We oscillate violently back and forth between the intoxicating, dangerous heights of arrogance when people praise us and the dark, crushing depths of self-loathing when we inevitably fail.
And as we have seen clearly today, neither the modern secular path of boosting our self-esteem through hollow affirmations, nor the traditional path of morbid self-mortification can grant true peace to the human soul. They are both dead ends because they both keep the self perched squarely on the throne at the center of the universe.
The gospel of Jesus Christ breaks these chains. It doesn't break them by telling us to artificially build our self-esteem, but by pointing us decisively away from ourselves entirely to Christ. He alone is our wisdom, our righteousness, our sanctification, and our redemption. Because we possess all things in Him, the world, life, death, the present, and the future, and because our core identity is eternally anchored in His finished work on the cross, the self is finally dethroned.
The pressure is off.
The pressure is totally off.
The
We don't have to try and think less of ourselves. We are finally free to just think of ourselves less. We can completely forget ourselves in the overwhelming joy of belonging to Him.
courtroom of the ego is permanently adjourned.
It is adjourned. And that leads me to a final provocative thought for you to take into your reality tomorrow. We have spent an hour talking about how the final eschatological judgment by Christ is meant to be a profound comfort. It frees us from the tyranny of other people's opinions and the trap of our own self-evaluations today.
Yeah.
So I want you to think about your specific schedule tomorrow morning. The Zoom meetings, the emails, the difficult conversations with your family, the commute. What if you consciously traded every single one of those interactions not as a performance that needs to be rated, but simply as an act of stewardship to be faithfully executed for the master? How might giving up the exhausting need to be impressive radically change the way you experience stress tomorrow morning?
That is the beautiful, quiet freedom of the under-rower. You don't have to steer the ship, you just have to pull the oar to the master's beat.
Let's pull the oar. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive on reform thinking. We'll see you next time.